Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. Dear honorary doctors, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. So it's a great pleasure and happiness that we are here today to honor an exceptional scientist and leader, Dr. Richard J. Hatchett, by conferring upon him an honorary doctorate from the University of Oslo. 1 year ago, that is Professor Professor Jens Berg, we had the honor of nominating Dr. Hatchett, and we are thrilled that the university has chosen to award him this important recognition. Since 2017, Richard J. Hatchett has been the Chief Executive Officer of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, which is headquartered here in Oslo. Through his remarkable strategic and scientific leadership, he has dramatically strengthened our global capacity to address existing infectious diseases and enhanced our preparedness to prevent the emergence of new pandemics, including this enigmatic disease X that looms in the horizon. CEPI, under Dr. Hatchett's leadership, represents a pioneering model for tackling major societal challenges by promoting research, development, and innovation through partnerships across public, private, and philanthropic sectors. Dr. Hatchett has background as a physician, having received his medical education from Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in the USA. A career-defining moment occurred during the terrorist attacks on New York City on September 11, 2001, where he organized a medical triage at Ground Zero. This resolution and boldness led to an invitation from President George W. Bush to establish a U.S. Medical Reserve Corps, which is a civilian medical reserve that now includes over 300,000 volunteer healthcare professionals. Between 2002 and 2016, Dr. Hatchett held several key positions within the U.S. health preparedness sector, focusing on chemical, biological, and nuclear threats. His contributions included leadership roles at the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA, where he played a crucial part in developing new vaccines for outbreaks like Ebola and Zika virus. His efforts in strategic research and innovation leadership have had far-reaching impact, laying the foundation for future successes. Under Dr. Hatchett's guidance, CEPI has grown from an initial $460 million in funding to an organization at $4 billion. This striking growth not only reflects his leadership and vision, but also his ability to build trust and partnerships across national borders and sectors. CEPI's vaccine development efforts have targeted diseases such as Lassa, MERS, Nipah, chikungunya, Rift Valley fever, Ebola, and COVID-19, with a focus on developing platforms capable of responding to outbreaks within 100 days. In addition to his work with CEPI, Dr. Hatchett played a crucial role in establishing COVAX, which strived for the equitable global distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. Under his leadership, COVAX delivered almost 2 billion vaccines to approximately 150 countries and promoted vaccine manufacturing in African countries. Dr. Hatchett's outstanding contributions have not gone unnoticed. He has participated in and led numerous committees and organizations and has received multiple awards for his work, including the prestigious North-South Prize of the Council of Europe for his efforts with COVAX. And recently, the government of Japan awarded him with the Order of the Rising Sun Gold Race with neck ribbon. So Dr. Hatchett is a strong and influential voice in the global health arena. Now, leaving what you might call the nomination documents and to search for more personal description of Richard, we can find this in the book Disease X, The 100 Days to End Pandemics by Kate Callan. She describes him as a Mississippi-born wannabe poet, turned cancer scientist, turned emergency room doctor, turned professional pandemic warrior. His journey is always driven by an insatiable curiosity and a profound commitment to humanity. Further, Richard is characterized as a Southern American gentleman, respectful, interested, and interesting. In his rare moments of leisure, Richard enjoys riding his bike through the southern English countryside, taking cultural holidays with his family, and reading books about everything, from famine to philosophy to chess. Richard has said about pandemics that they don't leave visible scars, they don't knock down buildings, they just fill up graveyards. At the University of Oslo, we have established the Center for Pandemic and Non-Health Research, or P1H, which has been headed by Professor Gunnar Grødland since March this year, and which is a part of the Sustainable Health Unit, SustainIT, headed by Professor Eivind Engebretsen. The aims of this center, which include promoting interdisciplinary research on pandemics and One Health in collaboration with external partners, is very much inspired by the model Dr. Hatchett has helped develop through his work with CEPI. So we look forward to collaborating with him and CEPI to further enhance our capabilities to research and innovate in this critical field. It is with immense joy and pride that we nominated Dr. Richard J. Hatchett as an honorary doctor at the University of Oslo. His significant contributions and tireless work for the betterment of society make him an exceedingly deserving recipient of this honorary degree. So please join me in giving Dr. Hatchett a warm round of applause as we recognize his great contributions to global health and security, and as we welcome him to the podium for his honorary doctorate lecture, which is entitled From Pathogens to Politics, Enhancing Biosecurity in an Age of Emerging Threats. So please and welcome.
Thank you. Just a quick sound check. Is this working? Perfect. I just have to say, Jens Petter, I can't remember if Kate Kellen described me as a professional pandemic worrier or a professional pandemic warrior. Possibly both. But thank you, Jens Petter, for that lovely, lovely introduction. And let me just start by expressing my warm thanks to the University of Oslo, to the medical faculty, to Dean Harbo, to the vice deans, and for the wonderful reception that my family and I, who are here with me, have had. It's truly a delight and an extraordinary honor to accept the honorary doctorate. So, last spring, Amy Herzog's adaptation of a Henrik Ibsen play, I believe the title, if you will forgive my poor Norwegian, is In Folkefiende, which in English is usually rendered as An Enemy of the People, opened on Broadway, starring Jeremy Strong, who is perhaps best known for playing Kendall Roy on Succession. In the role of the hero, or anti-hero, Dr. Thomas Stockmann. And Michael Imperioli, of Sopranos fame, making his Broadway debut as Stockmann's brother, Peter, the mayor, who, as the plot unfolds, becomes Stockmann's main antagonist. And the antagonism derives from Stockmann's discovering an inconvenient truth. The contamination of the water at the local spa, which is the main source of the town's income. And Stockmann's desire to publish his findings to protect the public's health. The central tension of the play arises from the conflict between, on the one hand, the economic, political, and social interest of the townspeople and the town's leading citizens, including Peter, and on the other, Stockmann's findings and his sense of the imminent danger they present, which, if publicized, would jeopardize the town's prosperity. And as the costs of heeding Stockman's warnings become clear, the townspeople turn against him, and he and his family are ostracized. Jeremy Strong, reflecting on the dilemma his character faces, said, "I think of Stockman as a guy who somehow wound up with a live grenade in his hands. One way or the other, it's going to blow up. So what do you do?" On the play's last night in previews, in front of an audience full of journalists and reviewers, members of the climate protest group Extinction Rebellion interrupted the town meeting scene in Act 4 to stage a provocation. The provocation was so well timed, in fact, that many in the audience initially thought the protest was part of the play's updated staging, a wry commentary on the play's contemporary themes. The New York Times reviewer noted that if this had really been devised by the producer and the play's translator, it would have been brilliant, completing the linkage of the play's concerns to ours and implicating us, fairly or not, as part of the problem being dramatized on stage. For the problem, the perennial problem that was being dramatized was complacency and the social forces that give rise to it. An Enemy of the People shows how, in communities facing imminent threats, a toxic brew of individual ambition, greed, conflicting agendas, and differing understandings of individual and communal responsibility can give rise to a paralysis that is functionally the equivalent of complacency. The end results inaction and, usually, condemnation of the messenger. The revival and Strong's performance caused a minor sensation in U.S. theater circles. Strong won the Tony Award for Best Actor in a Broadway production, and critics rhapsodized about the play's relevance and resonance in a society that had utterly failed the test presented by the pandemic and was equally failing in responding to the slow-motion catastrophe of climate change. A few noted the irony of the Extinction Rebellion protesters interrupting and shouting over the very character Stockman invoking science to warn of an environmental threat. In one sense, the protesters were shouting over their own spokesperson. If the artist had a point to make about environmental peril, they were disrupting its delivery. The protesters, however, would insist that they were making a point not to the characters on stage, but to the audience of well-heeled New Yorkers taking in a play at their leisure and seemingly, apparently, alarmingly oblivious to the imminence of a catastrophe threatening to engulf us all. "There is no Broadway on a dead planet," one of the protesters shouted as he was escorted from the theater. But then, perhaps we might regard this as a meta-commentary, if you will, on our current dilemma. We live in an age beset by crises. We are overwhelmed by crises. We are paralyzed by them. Professor Klaus Schwab and his colleagues at the World Economic Forum have embraced the unlovely term polycrisis, which dates back actually to the 1990s, to characterize the present. Former U.S. Treasury Secretary and President of Harvard University, Larry Summers, recently remarked of our current circumstances that this is the most complex, disparate, and cross-cutting set of challenges that I can remember in the 40 years that I have been paying attention to such things. Adam Tooze, a professor of history at Columbia University, describes the present as our tightrope walk with no end. It is not a pretty picture or a pleasant time, and it is easy to fall prey to anxiety or despair. It is also, perhaps, easy to become jaded by the array of imminent apocalyptic threats that we face. In a 2020 YouGov end of the world poll, I'm not kidding, almost 30% of Americans said that they expected an apocalyptic event in their lifetimes. Among the potential causes of such an event, the Christian Judgment Day, which you might expect to rank high for religious Americans, came in fourth, after a pandemic, climate change, and nuclear war. Judgment Day was ranked higher than zombies and aliens, but just barely. There have been prophets of the apocalypse, of course, at least since John of Patmos. Even before the bomb, in 1893, the French astronomer, science fiction writer, and spiritualist Camille Flammarion compared humanity to a man walking down a street lined with snipers. What changed irrevocably on July 16, 1945, when the first atomic bomb was detonated near Alamogordo, was the time horizon against which the end of the world might play out. It was no longer simply a thermodynamic inevitability, the sun gobbling up the inner planets as it runs out of fuel. And it was no longer exclusively the domain of terrible cosmic or geologic forces beyond human control or understanding. The age of anthropogenic apocalypse had arrived, and it could occur tomorrow. It could occur today. Whether it occurred at all would depend on humanity's choices. And as Ibsen might have pointed out, society's track record at making good choices was not reassuring. Susan Sontag quipped that the title of Francis Ford Coppola's movie Apocalypse Now was wishful thinking, that what we are living with instead is apocalypse from now on. With technological advance, the number of civilization killers began to grow to include threats that required intentional action to materialize, such as nuclear weaponry, as well as threats created by humans that were products of collective behavior, climate change, for example, or that might act in ways beyond human control or intention, like nanotechnology, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence. The growing list of threats even acquired a taxonomy. In 2008, Nick Bostrom, founder of Oxford's now defunct Future of Humanity Institute, and the Serbian astronomer Milan Cirkovic defined a catastrophic risk as one that might have the potential to inflict serious damage to human well-being on a global scale, and an existential risk as one that threatens to cause the extinction of Earth-originating intelligent life or to reduce its quality of life permanently and drastically. Philosophers, ethical altruists, and some of the weirder transhumanists, not least Elon Musk, began to formulate an ethics through time that they referred to, in my opinion, and elegantly, as long-termism. Toby Ord, one of the leading ethical altruists in his book, The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity, identified the two leading risks to humanity's survival in the next century as unaligned AI, with an existential risk he estimated at 1 in 10, exceeding all other risks combined, and an engineered pandemic with an existential risk of 1 in 30. Mustafa Suleyman, one of the founders of DeepMind, last year published a very, very important book, The Coming Wave, about these entwined threats. If you haven't read it, and you care about the future of our species, I would implore you to do so. If you'll indulge me, I'll read a passage from the introduction that puts it about as plainly as it can be put. In the annals of human history, Suleyman writes, there are moments that stand out as turning points where the fate of humanity hangs in the balance. The discovery of fire, the invention of the wheel, the harnessing of electricity, all of these were moments that transformed human civilization, altering the course of history forever. And now we stand at the brink of another such moment as we face the rise of a coming wave of technologies that includes both advanced AI and biotechnology. On the one hand, he continues, the potential benefits of these technologies are vast and profound. But on the other hand, the potential dangers of these technologies are equally vast and profound. With AI, we could create systems that are beyond our control and find ourselves at the mercy of algorithms that we don't understand. With biotechnology, we could manipulate the very building blocks of life, potentially creating unintended consequences for both individuals and entire ecosystems. As we stand at this turning point, we are faced with a choice between a future of unparalleled possibility and a future of unimaginable peril. The fate of humanity hangs in the balance, and the decisions we make in the coming years and decades will determine whether we rise to the challenge of these technologies or fall victim to their dangers. These are rather high stakes. So what do we do with this? What can we do with this? Suleiman frames the problem as one of what he calls containment. Can the technologies be contained, their benefits reaped, while controls of some type prevent their harms from being realized? He would like to believe it possible, but all of human experience with transformative technology to date tells him and us otherwise. The narrow path must be walked forever from here on out, Suleiman writes, and all it takes is one misstep to tumble into the abyss, end quote. And history suggests that the pattern of technology development and diffusion that creates this risk is locked in. The economic and intellectual incentives for such diffusion and for the elaboration and proliferation of the underlying technologies are huge and entrenched. Now, we can draw a slender reed of comfort from the fact that over the last 80 years, we haven't blown ourselves to kingdom come. Immediately after World War II, in the wake of the atomic bombings, scientific and political leaders imagined that we faced a similar polarity between a future paradise built on access to virtually unlimited energy and the world-shattering apocalypse of nuclear war. Neither the paradise nor the hell have materialized. But the problem was also structured differently. Churchill, in his last major speech to the British Parliament in March of 1955, summed up the logic of deterrence memorably. It may well be, he said, that we shall, by a process of sublime irony, have reached a stage in this story where safety will be the sturdy child of terror and survival the twin brother of annihilation. But deterrence won't work where the risk can't be confined to the decisions of a limited number of actors facing each other in a conventionally structured contest or conflict, and where accountability is diffuse. And that is the case here. The rewards of the enabling research are near, the hypothetical consequences remote. To frame it more cynically, the rewards can be pocketed and the consequences externalized. It will be difficult, impossible to hold anyone accountable for creating conditions that endanger and imperil us all. Most risk created by advances in the biological sciences derives from the fungibility of the tools created to solve specific problems. The tools that will solve a pressing problem are empowering, but there is no intrinsic limit to their application. Biologists tackle practical problems through the rigorous application of method and technique, borrowed, adapted, or invented. And it is this aspect of how science is done that gives rise to the problem of dual use. Solve the problem of gene insertion and you can cure disease, or enable a virus to evade our countermeasures. But trying to impose limits on scientists as they tackle their problems and develop their techniques is a fool's errand. Oppenheimer, reflecting on the incentives that had driven scientists to develop the terrible device of the atomic bomb, said, when you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you have had your technical success. Everything that I have observed across the now more than 2 decades I've been worrying about biological risk confirms that this dynamic operates in the biological sciences as well. The scientific work that has produced the greatest controversy, the deliberate creation of mammalian transmissible H5N1 viruses by Fouché and Kawaoka, and gain-of-function research in general, the reconstruction of infectious horsepox from chemically synthesized mail-order DNA by Evans and Noyce, or the inadvertent creation of a highly lethal IL-4 recombinant mousepox by Jackson and Ramshaw, all has or had its justification. Even more so, the now widely adopted methods of AI-enabled in silico structure prediction and molecular design, which will both accelerate the development of new drugs and vaccines and democratize such work by greatly reducing the barriers to entry for scientists around the world. Neil King from the Institute of Protein Design at the University of Washington in Seattle has observed that tools such as AlphaFold, RF diffusion, protein MPNN, and others, as he puts it, push the bottlenecks of drug discovery and development downstream, so that clinical development and navigating the regulatory process become the major rate limiters, rather than the upstream processes of discovery and prototype design. The positive impact these tools will have will be enormous, and of course they will become more accurate and thus more powerful with time, which guarantees that their use will proliferate. It seems logical to infer that the risk of their potential misuse or the risk of accidents occurring as the result of their use will increase as a function of this proliferation. In the absence of controls, the potential harm of their deliberate misuse will also increase as the tools are improved. These trends are ineluctable. And this is independent of the risk of simple accidents that don't require advanced technology to materialize. The number of high containment laboratories is increasing rapidly. In 2018, Alexandra Peters found that 86 countries possessed or were actively building biological laboratories at biosafety level 3 or 4. In 2021, Felipe Lentzos and Gregory Koblenz documented 42 operational BSL-4 maximum containment facilities in 23 countries, with 17 more planned or under construction. More than 3/4 of these were situated in urban centers, which would presumably facilitate disease amplification in the event of any accidental release. In the US alone, there are 13 BSL-4 and more than 1,600 BSL-3 laboratories. The risk surface is huge. Even leaving aside COVID-19, whose origins, of course, are controversial, we know with a fair degree of certainty that at least one pandemic, the so-called Russian flu of 1977, was caused by a lab release or accident in a vaccine trial, probably originating not in Russia, but in China. Fortunately, the virus that caused the mini pandemic, it only infected people under the age of 26, was exceptionally mild. But accidents happen. Systems that depend on humans fail. Not everything can be predicted or prevented. Next time, we may not be so lucky. And many believe we've already had next time and weren't. So this is the environment in which my organization, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, now operates. We were originally created to address the growing threat of epidemics by developing vaccines against what are essentially neglected tropical diseases, diseases that primarily affect low or lower middle income countries that are episodic in their emergence and for which no countermeasures exist. Diseases like Ebola, Lassa fever, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya, or Nipah. In causing local or regional epidemics, these diseases can be hugely disruptive. The West African Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 2016, for example, was estimated to have imposed in a very poor region a total economic burden of more than $50 billion. I am pleased to say that we have made substantial progress against these diseases. We now have licensed vaccines for Ebola and chikungunya. A Lassa vaccine has entered field trials in West Africa, and Rift Valley fever, Nipah, and MERS vaccines are in early clinical trials. COVID-19, however, was a disease and a challenge of a different order. It precipitated the greatest global public health crisis in a century, and responding to it transformed CEPI. When the pandemic started, we were an organization of fewer than 60 employees. Today, we are an organization with a multi-billion-dollar R&D portfolio and well over 300 staff. We were the first organization globally to fund the development of COVID vaccines, issuing our first 3 contracts on January 23rd, 2020. We supported the largest portfolio of COVID vaccines globally, with 7 of the vaccines we invested in achieving licensure and 4 achieving WHO pre-qualification or emergency use listing. CEPI supported important innovations. One of the first vaccines we funded was the Moderna vaccine. And another, SKY-CoV-1, manufactured by SK Biosciences in Korea, though it was not approved until 2022, was the first medical product designed using artificial intelligence to be approved for any indication anywhere in the world. And we conceptualized and co-founded COVAX, which, though it didn't achieve our goal of preventing vaccine inequity, still delivered almost 2 billion doses of vaccine to 146 countries, to be precise, saving an estimated 2.7 million lives. COVID-19 also transformed CEPI's mission. In the wake of the pandemic, we formulated and are now the chief evangelists of the idea that the world must be able to deliver countermeasures, including vaccines, within 100 days of the identification of new pathogens with pandemic potential. This idea has caught fire. It has been embraced by the G7 and written into national pandemic preparedness plans around the world. For our part, we've mapped out what it will actually take to deliver vaccines in 100 days and begun to assemble the necessary componentry. We fully anticipate that the application of artificial intelligence and machine learning tools to immunogen and vaccine design and other aspects of the vaccine development lifecycle will greatly enable this work. And we have established a consortium of some of the world's leading structural virologists and computer scientists to begin building a library of immunogen designs using these tools. We are working with clinical trial partners in different regions to plan for and develop the protocols necessary to conduct rapid clinical trials of new vaccines in outbreak settings. We have established strategic partnerships with Moderna, BioNTech, Oxford University to develop exemplar vaccines on validated platforms against prototype pathogens from different viral families of concern. This is an investment that is already paying off. With BioNTech, we had invested in developing their mRNA mpox vaccine as an exemplar orthopox virus vaccine and are now accelerating its development for potential deployment in clinical trials in the current outbreak. Through this same partnership, we have also supported the expansion of the only commercial-scale mRNA production facility in Africa, in Kigali. More broadly, where manufacturing is concerned, we have established a network of manufacturing partners across Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, and are working to ensure that they have access to rapid response platform technologies that will enable them to scale up production of vaccines in the next pandemic much more rapidly than in 2020. From an infectious disease perspective, 2024 has been a remarkable year. The world is grappling with the mpox epidemic in Central Africa, outbreaks of H5N1 and West Nile virus in North America, and large epidemics of vector-borne diseases such as dengue, chikungunya, Zika, and Oropouche in South America. These are all concerning, even urgent situations. The mpox epidemics, as you probably all know, has been declared a public health emergency of continental security by Africa CDC and of international concern by WHO. CEPI is directly involved in the response to mpox while also working to design and test better H5N1 immunogens on top of our day-to-day work. Emergency response is challenging and requires its own organizational structures. It can easily distract organizations from their longer-term priorities and take attention away from risks that haven't yet materialized. But I want to say something today that I believe is critical. Even as we deal with these current exigencies, and even as we prepare for other naturally emerging threats, it would be imprudent in the extreme to defer grappling with the way the combination of new AI tools and expansion of high containment facilities is transforming the infectious disease risk landscape. Any strategy aiming to achieve health security for the world must embed and reinforce mechanisms to ensure that the highest, most current standards of biosecurity and biosafety are practiced and maintained. To this end, for the last year, and with the generous support of the Government of Canada, CEPI has been digging into the question of what we as a funding organization and international nonprofit can do to elevate attention to what we believe to be a clear and imminent danger, and to promulgate standards and practices commensurate with our mandate, obligations, and responsibilities. I have just returned from Seoul, where I am pleased to say that on Friday, our board approved CEPI's first biosecurity strategy, which we will be sharing publicly in the next few weeks, and elements of which I'd like to share with you now. Let me start by providing the context that CEPI manages a highly diverse $3 billion research portfolio in more than 50 countries, which between them have highly variable oversight practices for reducing biosafety and biosecurity risks. Core to the idea of CEPI having a biosecurity strategy is the recognition that as a steward of global funds, no matter where those funds are deployed, we have a critical responsibility to ensure that the research we fund does not lead to the next accident or deliberate incident. First and foremost, our biosecurity focus must be to protect human populations from epidemics and pandemic threats, with an emphasis on preventing accidental and deliberate misuse of pathogens associated with CEPI-sponsored research, which includes some of the most high-consequence pathogens on the planet. To develop our strategy, we have undertaken an extensive consultative process, engaging more than 150 entities across the global health and security ecosystems, representing government, civil society, and industry. We assembled and have been advised by a globally representative biosecurity strategy group with members from 5 continents. We have solicited expert feedback on discrete strategy priority areas, and we have convened panels, conducted tabletop exercises, signed MOUs with critical partners, and published position papers as the strategy has developed. Through this process, we have identified what we believe to be 5 critical vulnerabilities shaping the global risk landscape, and derived from these 5 priority areas for CEPI action. The vulnerabilities, they are really intersecting dimensions of vulnerability, include the variable global biosafety and biosecurity practices for risk identification that I have already alluded to, with the related vulnerability deriving from substantial variations in biosafety and biosecurity policies, regulations, practices, and competencies in the different jurisdictions and settings where CEPI-funded work is performed. A third vulnerability, which I believe we may be among the first to highlight, is that the intersection between biosecurity and equity is insufficiently recognized. The fourth I have already briefly described, which is that emerging biotechnology and converging technologies present dynamic and evolving biosecurity risks. And the fifth and final risk, which is more of a yawning gap, really, is that the world is insufficiently harnessing technological innovation to reduce safety and security vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities create concomitant opportunities for CEPI action, which the strategy describes at a high level and which we will further flesh out in an implementation plan that we anticipate publishing in the first quarter of next year. While the strategy document foreshadows areas where CEPI intends to focus its efforts, we have deliberately deferred spelling out our implementation approach with too much specificity so that it can be informed by stakeholder feedback to the published strategy. I'd like to highlight just a few points now relating first to CEPI's understanding of its role as a funder, second to the issue of equity, and third to the question of how we can leverage innovation to reduce our risks. With respect to our role as a funder, it is important to differentiate the role we envision for ourselves from that of the properly constituted normative bodies. Normative organizations like the WHO and the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, are playing a critical role in setting out guidance documents and frameworks for laboratories working with high-consequence pathogens around the world. And commitments from countries have been underscored by the recent adoption of a resolution on strengthening laboratory biological risk management at the 77th World Health Assembly in May of this year. CEPI and other funders of life sciences research have an important role to play in the implementation of these efforts and can be instrumental in ensuring that high standards are deployed in the research and capabilities they fund. CEPI, along with the Nuclear Threat Initiative, has already launched a Biofunders Compact, which demonstrates its signatories' mutual commitment to prioritizing biosecurity and biosafety as a critical component of research and development in the life sciences and pandemic preparedness and response. With respect to the issue of equity, CEPI is well positioned to incentivize the application of consistent, globally recognized biosafety and biosecurity norms, practices, and principles for research involving high-consequence pathogens while working to build biosecurity and biosafety capabilities in low and middle-income countries. This can help accelerate diverse, equitable, and merit-based participation across the vaccine research, development, and manufacturing continuum, foster broader adherence to biosafety and biosecurity guidance from WHO and global stakeholders, and drive equitable development of vaccine products, platforms, and capabilities. Global scientific participation is critical to the success of the 100 Days mission and will enable vaccine research, development, and manufacturing to take place in communities that need it, led by those who will benefit from it, and informed by the priorities of the vulnerable communities that are disproportionately impacted by epidemics and pandemics. Finally, with respect to the need for innovation in this space, as technological capabilities evolve and boundaries blur between disciplines, I think we should anticipate that traditional approaches may prove inadequate to address emerging threats. To prevent that, it will be imperative for stakeholders across civil society, industry, and government to collaborate closely, anticipate new risks, and develop agile response mechanisms to promote responsible use in ways that appropriately balance risks and benefits. Key challenges that will need to be addressed if we want to promote true innovation include fixing the currently fragmented information sharing systems, including of evidence-based outcomes, inadequate interoperability, and limited adoption of emerging technologies for real-time monitoring and response. One of the roles that CEPI can play is in catalyzing cooperation among stakeholders, investing in research and development, and prioritizing the integration of innovative technologies into the existing frameworks. In doing so, we can strengthen the global health and security ecosystems, thereby enhancing our ability to mitigate risks and accelerate global progress towards 100-day mission goals. This has been a fast tour, perhaps not fast enough, but a fast tour of some very important work that CEPI has only recently undertaken. And I am pleased to be able to share this with all of you for the very first time. This is the first time I've spoken about this publicly. CEPI's work in this space will undoubtedly continue to evolve, and we want to define implementation approaches that neither unnecessarily impede the pace of research nor conflict with national priorities. We are especially attuned to the need to reduce risks across both the global north and south in the interest of enhancing research capacity globally and in an equitable fashion, and we welcome everyone's input to this process. I have set the problem for you as I understand it. I don't have any global solutions to offer. But I have told you what we at CEPI are trying to do on a practical level to manage biological risk in the context of our present challenges. We are trying, as an organization, to embody what Max Weber described as an ethics of responsibility in light of our understanding of the threats the world now faces. We accept that our sciences will pursue what they perceive to be technically sweet. It would be almost unethical of them not to do what they know is feasible. This is how the world progresses. As funders, however, we have to act in a way, as Weber puts it, that takes account of and takes responsibility for the foreseeable consequences of our actions. The consequences of what we do are part and parcel of the actions themselves. They cannot be treated as externalities. For progress, there is no cure, John von Neumann memorably wrote towards the end of his life in an essay entitled, "Can We Survive Technology?" The only safety possible, he thought, is relative, and it lies in an intelligent exercise of day-to-day judgment and a long sequence of small, correct decisions. I began this lecture by referencing Henrik Ibsen. Let me close it with an anecdote told by a more contemporary writer, the remarkably prescient science fiction writer Octavia Butler, who died in 2006. Her greatest novels, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, were published in the 1990s and describe an imagined America of the 2020s, in which a conservative populist and autocrat has become president by promising to make America great again. I'm not making this up. Page 15, Parable of the Talents. In the year 2000, Butler published an essay entitled "A Few Rules for Predicting the Future," which begins with this anecdote, which is a wonderful way to conclude what I hope has not been a depressing talk. So do you really believe that in the future we're going to have the kind of trouble you write about in your books? A student asked me as I was signing books after a talk. The young man was referring to the troubles I'd described in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, novels that take place in a near future of increasing drug addiction and illiteracy, marked by the popularity of prisons and the unpopularity of public schools, the vast and growing gap between the rich and everyone else, and the whole nasty family of problems brought on by global warming. I didn't make up the problems, I pointed out. All I did was look around at the problems we're neglecting now and give them 30 years to grow into full-fledged disasters. Okay, the young man challenged, so what's the answer? There isn't one, I told him. No answer, you mean we're just doomed? He smiled as though he thought this might be a joke. No, I said, I mean there's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers at least. You can be one of them if you choose to be. Several days later, by mail, I received a copy of the young man's story in his college newspaper. He mentioned my talk, listed some of my books and the future problems they dealt with. Then he quoted his own question, what's the answer? The article ended with the first 3 words of my reply, wrongly left standing alone. There isn't one. It's sadly easy to reverse meaning, in fact, to tell a lie by offering an accurate but incomplete quote. In this case, it was frustrating because the one thing that I and my main characters never do when contemplating the future is give up hope. In fact, the very act of trying to look ahead to discern possibilities and offer warnings is in itself an act of hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hatchett. We can now all breathe again. You've given us some really deep reflections and, I would say, enlightening perspectives. So who wants to challenge that?
It is a very ingenuous question, so thank you so much. I mean, it makes us really think, I was just thinking, would there be ways, or maybe I missed it, but you have maybe something in mind, are there ways to somehow predict that a virus that is in an animal, because this is what sometimes happens, mutates and then is transmitted to humans, because this has been happening, all over these years. So what could be, AI, is that a way to go to predict that, because just taking a little animal and say, okay, this animal have a virus, a chicken, a bat, or, and how could we predict that, It is very ingenious.
So we actually are supporting a number of groups looking at the phenomenon of spillover, and there are a couple of philosophical approaches that you can take. There have been one set of investigators who have gone out to do biological prospecting, trying to collect viruses, and another set of investigators who think that the scale of what that would require is beyond success, and that actually the biological prospecting creates risk. For those who believe that COVID might have been related to an accident, they can point to the collection of coronavirus specimens and concentration in laboratories. And some of the partners that we're working with using artificial intelligence this is a step towards what you're describing. I don't think it's at the level that you're talking about yet, but using artificial intelligence to predict viral mutation, in the wake of the human immune response effectively, and the viruses have a Darwinian imperative to evolve. I recently heard an estimate that it would take 1 trillion terabytes, which is a yottabyte if anybody's counting, but it would take 1 trillion terabytes to model the human immune system in all of its complexity. And that seems like a very large number, but we're actually moving towards that in terms of the kind of data acquisition that we're doing now. And so in the future, one might imagine that that kind of prediction with greater precision might be possible. Right now, the approach that we're taking as an organization is to recognize that there are about 25 families of virus that are known to cause human disease, and see if we can develop generalizable approaches to countermeasures development against viruses that we know in each family. And that approach has just been endorsed and embraced by WHO, actually. And I think there is a scientific convergence that from a sort of a, economy and efficiency perspective, having generalizable approaches that we can adapt very rapidly is probably our best defense right now.
I think I have one more.
Question, it's a comment. And I hope that all of you have recognized the way that Richard have described CEPI, that it is connecting basic research to applied field situations in the poorest countries in the world. It is bringing east to west. It is a unifying, it's a really an organization that is campaigning for equity in the world, which is a great threat also in the collaboration of pandemic prevention. Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah. Thank you, Tore. Just to underscore that, when CEPI was first established, our first mission statement said that we were an organization that was developed to create vaccines against epidemic diseases. And we changed that mission statement. And now it says that we are an organization, and we've added pandemic, but to create vaccines against epidemic and pandemic diseases, and to ensure equitable access to those products for the populations that need them. And what we try to do is bring an equity frame. We start with equity, and then we design solutions that will help us achieve equitable access to vaccines. And of course, we very early on in the pandemic, even as early as January or February of 2020, anticipated the disparity of access that we were likely to encounter when vaccines became available, and particularly during periods when they were characterized by scarcity, because we've seen that before. That's exactly what we saw during the last pandemic in 2009. And so Tore, I was giving a different kind of a talk, but the point that you're making is critical to understanding what we do as an organization.
Yeah, fantastic. So I have more a kind of, maybe an unfair question even. So as I understand, you basically have a organization that basically tries to influence and make policies for many countries, fighting biohazards and establishing rules and strategies for this. Of course, now COVID and so on has shown us very clearly that there's lots of people actually, they don't want to have this. Vaccines is out of the question. I mean, for me, from Germany, there's whatever, 15% of the population no, we don't get a vaccine. So do you see any role of CEPI on a more global scale to influence that kind of, stupidity, if you might say?
You said it. So we're asked that question a lot, and particularly because in espousing the idea of positioning ourselves through a lot of prior investment. I mean, we're not talking about creating vaccines in 100 days on the fly out of the blue. We're talking about years of investment in preparedness, but then being able to deliver vaccines rapidly when the new threat emerges. But the idea of a vaccine that is created that fast is going to be a provocation to those who sincerely believe, or question vaccines, what right or wrong, informed, uninformed, whatever. But I think one thing that we saw during the pandemic, which throws a real new element into it, is that there were forces, some of them state-sponsored, some of them not, who wanted to create polarization within countries and just viewed the vaccine question as a tool. And they truly didn't care. It wasn't that there was sincere belief about questioning vaccines. It was that this was a way to introduce pressure and tension into what was already a very difficult situation because it served larger geopolitical or political goals that they may have had. So I think we do have a role in combating misunderstanding and misinformation. And I would differentiate misinformation from malicious, deliberate disinformation. And so I don't think even with perfect knowledge and even with perfect sort of communication goals, which most in government and science and public health don't have to begin with, I don't think that we could get rid of the disinformation that will emerge in the future. So I think we have to have strategies for providing information to those who will hear and overcoming the noise of misinformation on the one hand and disinformation on the other. And I don't think we're very sophisticated at doing that yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for this marvelous speech. You referred to the concept of, or the word polycrisis, which of course means that there is also, among all these crises, a competition for funding. And how can we secure that funding for these important issues that you have talked about now is continued in a world where the pandemic's remembrance is so something of the past and something that maybe not be highly prioritized among the politicians and the governments?
Sort of, maybe 3 points on that. I mean, the first is historically, if you look at populations' experience of infectious disease crises, I mean, you mentioned my quote about not knocking down, but like there are no memorials to victims of Spanish flu, and as far as I'm aware, there are no memorials to victims of COVID. It is a crisis that doesn't have a moral context. There's no moral meaning. And so people, people historically have wanted to just move on. Like when an individual disease comes and goes, it's terrible. Everybody's miserable until the disease subsides, and then they want to get back to normal life. And that dynamic leads to people and governments treating each disease as sui generis and thinking in terms of the specific disease, whether it's Ebola, Spanish flu, COVID, rather than recognizing each disease as an instantiation of a category of threat that we are going to face in perpetuity, and which many trends in modern life and facts of the modern world, like climate change, are driving in the wrong direction. And so one thing that we need to do to keep awareness of the threat is keep reminding, this isn't about Ebola on the one hand, COVID on the next hand, in individual diseases. It's about a evolutionary dynamic that we are immersed in that will continue. That's why I mentioned 2024 being such a remarkable year. We have big infectious disease crises on multiple continents, and people aren't really talking about that. There is an acceleration of risk that has nothing to do with AI or biocontainment laboratories. That's on top of the accelerating risk of the modern world. And so we have to change the conversation to be about the category of risk. The other thing that we need to do, I think, is when CEPI was first established, most of the funding that came to CEPI came from development agencies. It was viewed as just another it was sort of a subset of global health. And I would argue that this is principally, first and foremost, this is a security problem for the world. It's about health security, but it's about economic security, it's about national security. And security problems are fundamentally problems that people accept their governments exist to address. And they accept expenditure and even lack of perfect efficiency. What is a military is, in the most abstract sense, is just sort of national surge capacity. And we're willing to pay for that, and it has a utility even if people aren't firing the weapons, but we accept that we have to pay for that. And we have to think about and I'm going to mix the terms here, but our biosecurity infrastructure as something that we need to embed in modern society. And there are other kinds of security problems, and I'll just mention two, and I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but cybersecurity is an example of, we all get it. If we want to live in a digitally interconnected world, there have to be government programs, there have to be corporate programs, and individuals have to pay something to be part of that digitally interconnected world, or they're going to be at risk for the security threats. Well, it's the exact same in the biologically interconnected world that we live in, but we haven't yet figured out how to define the problem in the way the cybersecurity community has, because the costs are now, it's not purely government, it's not purely private, their costs are distributed. There's a whole evolving infrastructure that promotes innovation, updates, our tools, and continues to get better and better against a whole array of threats, which, everything from ransomware to viruses to phishing attempts. And we accept that in the cyberspace. We haven't evolved our understanding of the biology space yet. So that's one of the things. One thing, this has subsided from the agendas of heads of state, but globally, after the pandemic, the fact that so many new pandemic institutions or pandemic-focused centers or national institutions are being created speaks to a increased global attention that still needs to be facilitated, supported, whatever. But I'm generally actually optimistic, but I think we've got to get our storytelling right with our senior leaders.
We have many more questions, but that's not for now, so thank you again so much.
Yeah.